ربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something else that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone fixed me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Welcome to Varn blog, and today Dr. Kuba is with us to talk about the Ukraine crisis. But I wanted to do a preface about why I have avoided extensive commentary on this conflict. The internet is an information war zone, and many people on it are unintentionally contributing to one side or the other, whether they're spreading NATO or Russian Federation propaganda or oversimplifying what is a historically complex narrative. This is important to understand because if we are to understand how we are to act in the world, not taking simplistic sides is often vital. I also say this because today I'm going to talk about a conflict in which I have friends, personal friends, on both sides, both expatriates and locals, in Ukraine and Russia. I have lived abroad for 9 years of my life, mostly in East Asia and Mexico, but also in Egypt. And so in all those places except Mexico, I have encountered Russians and Ukrainians. I have been following the news going out of Ukraine since the Orange Revolution, the Orange Revolution, and I have been following what's been going on with Yushchenko and Yanukovych and the various militia factions for a long time. Much of the commentary I've seen from both pro-Russia and pro-NATO factions has been, frankly, aiding to the fog of war. Furthermore, historical materialist analysis and even sound geopolitical analysis requires one to take a neutral view of states. This is very hard for me personally to do, as I do have people in this conflict. So while we may sound totally amoral and apolitical in our analysis here, and we have to because we're discussing states and war, who frankly cannot be read as moral actors. Individual leaders maybe can, interests can be discussed, but states should not be read as moral actors. And as such, I'm going to sound cold to both sides. This is necessary to understanding the context and the situation, as this is a live conflict. And I feel kind of frankly ridiculous that I need to put this preface in this video. I will say my bias is that any expansion of the conflict could lead to a world war. And I don't think that world war is in the interest of almost anyone, even the capitalist powers, but it is definitely not in the interest of workers, peasants, marginal groups, not just in Europe and NATO countries, but around the world. One thing we will discuss today is how this conflict may actually play out in areas that are often forgotten and left out of North American and Eurocentric commentary. After all, one of Russia's main contributions to the old BRICS allegiance, one that we have seen seemingly quasi-formed in the last few days, reformed really, is its grain. So we have to take that into the account as we talk about the possible considerations of this conflict. Furthermore, simpleton analysis of conflicts as, Nazis versus anti-imperialist in this conflict in particular seems particularly, vapid. As we will discuss to some degree, there are fascistic factions on both sides. There are interests in both sides, and the media portrayal in Slavic languages versus the media portrayal in English, both coming out of Russia and coming out of the Ukraine, will be very, very different. Another reason I've been hesitant to comment, and then I'm going to let Dr. Kuba come in, is that I do not read or speak the relevant languages. I do not read or speak Russian, although I can have it translated, and I have friends who do speak Russian, and I often double check with them. And I do not read or speak Ukrainian, although, again, I have friends who read and speak Ukrainian and can help me with that as well. But I don't do it myself. This is not an area in which I have access to primary language news sources, nor would I trust them anyway. For English news, I have gone to the Moscow Times for Russian news and to Al Jazeera and other Middle Eastern and North African news sources written in English for international news because they have been less biased. There are also certain foreign policy and war strategic magazines I have looked towards. And the analysts I have depended upon the most have been Michael Kaufman and John Mearsheimer. Michael Kaufman is a Russian military specialist, one who is normally not known for being particularly anti-Russian, and John Mearsheimer is a political realist and a conservative one at that. And with that, my two mainstream sources and why I have been quiet and why I think we have to be very careful in talking about this. Do not take anything we say as condemnation or support of either side, although frankly I will say under international law I would have to say that things are not looking so benevolent for the Russian side, but we'll talk about that more. All right. Hello, Dr. Kuba.
Hello, Varn. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on the Varn vlog. Thank you.
I wish you've been on a lot lately, and I wish you had been on for under better circumstances. You are one of several people I'll be having on talking about this, although some of the people I've been asked to bring on, I am hesitant to because it could endanger them. Not everyone who is asked to speak to me is safely in the United States, Canada, or the far reaches of Western Europe. All right. So I'm going to tell everyone, I'm going to say today, I would suggest that people listen to your discussion on This Is Revolution on Ukraine, which I believe has been available in podcast form 2 days ago. You can find it in the show notes. And also your interview with Parallax Views, which I thought was very informative. You can also find it in the show notes. So we're not going to cover all of that today so that we can talk about stuff that's new, because this is developing so fast and so sporadically. We are going to have to kind of jump into things head first. So where are we at today? It seems like, or even yesterday, it seems like with the Ukrainian president calling for a no-fly zone, which everyone who has any geostrategic sense knows is an open invitation for world war. Things have gotten much more desperate than the first 4 days, where it looks like the Russians were performing poorly.
Well, I would be remiss not to also plug the discussions I had with Doug Lane and Stefan Bertrand Lee on Pop the Left.
I will include those in the show notes soon.
Yeah, the talking with Stefan was particularly illuminating because he has some actual battlefield experience as a volunteer for the YPG in the Syrian conflict. So he has a perspective which, especially on the online left, is unusual. But to tack back to the current situation, the infamous heavy armor column has reached Ukraine. has reached Kiev, rather, and is in the process of encircling the city. It looks like the advance from the northeast and the drive south towards Kiev have linked up to the south of Chernigov, creating a pocket. The city of Chernigov itself has been cut off, the entrances and exits mined. The Sea of Azov front, which is the drive northeast from Crimea, it looks like Russian forces have linked up around the city of Mariupol with the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics coming in from further east. The drive to the southwest from Crimea towards Odessa, the city of Kherson has been captured, and the region south of the Dnieper to the Black Sea coast looks like it's under Russian control. There's been some changes in Russian tactics with a less restraint in terms of targeting Ukrainian forces in urban centers. This inevitably leads to greater civilian casualties, but we haven't reached the stage yet of indiscriminate urban destruction, as in Grozny, as in Aleppo, as in Syria, which has been part of the Russian war toolkit. It's unclear if we'll get there. After all, despite the carnage of engaging forces in urban centers, there's little that you can do as a warfighter, whatever, putting aside entirely the legitimacy of the cause. If your enemies are entrenched in cities and the cities are strategically essential, then urban warfare is the only possible course of action at your disposal. When there isn't a time crunch, as in Chernigov, then it's possible to surround and besiege the city. But from the Russian perspective, Kiev is such an important strategic objective. The port of Mariupol is also strategically significant. So in areas such as those, the likelihood of urban conflict and the casualties and destruction that come with it is high. The Ukrainian resistance has been more spirited and stiffer than many people, myself included, expected. And Russians are sustaining losses. In some ways, they're underperforming expectations. For instance, despite early announcements that they had total air superiority, it looks like Ukrainian aircraft are still able to operate. It's a contested airspace, so they don't have air superiority either. But Russians don't completely command the skies. There's been less engagement by the Russian Air Force than expected, and I could go into some theories as to why that might be. The long mechanized armor and truck motorized columns have been hit with javelins and other specialized weapons provided by NATO to take them out. It looks like the sort of reserve and citizens units that Ukraine mobilized are having an effect. But despite the losses that Russia is taking, and when you enter a heavily defended country, you're the aggressor, losses are to be expected. The drive towards their strategic objectives continues. They continue to gain territory. They continue to move. None of their major territorial gains have been reversed by Ukrainians. It's really a losing battle, very costly on both sides.
There's a couple of things that I think people should probably read up on for understanding the tactics here. I'm not getting into the history; it's been well discussed in other places, although we will touch on it later. The Russian use of restraint should not be read, and particularly the first days, it was both rapid and restrained, and that they, instead of doing what a lot of people predicted and repeating their strategy from the Georgian War, and just going in, securing the two separatist republics, and leaving it at that, more or less. They made a beeline directly for Kiev. But they did so in a way that either belies that they didn't think there was going to be as much resistance as they got, or for hearts and minds reasons, they did not want to heavily hit the population to build an even larger long-term insurgency. I suspect it's both. But one should look at the low casualties of the first day on the Ukrainian side as a strategic loss. There are other complications, however. I mean, one thing it does seem is that information within Russia, even on low levels of the military, about the precise nature of the invasion was kept even from the local populations, not just from the international stage. Also, probably to keep it from the international stage because it's harder and harder to keep information quiet. So it does seem like some of the younger recruits, particularly from Russia itself, were a little bit caught off guard. But that's all corrected. I have also been interested in the lack of the Russian Air Force because while, it's fourth generation fighter planes, we don't really know how many there are, really. Even a bunch of MiGs could be far more destructive than people realize. And I have been wondering how much of this is related to the fact that that both NATO and Ukraine had an advantage on the global information war perspective. So for and the info war, to use a terrible phrase, the Ukraine was able to get a jump kick, even though its own intelligence apparatuses seemed to be somewhat blindsided and thought the U.S. was bluffing. And that has been interesting as far as understanding what's going on right now. But I do wonder ultimately what you're left with, because in a conventional war, if Ukraine does not get outside support, and since Russia is a nuclear power, the likelihood of it getting direct outside support is pretty much nil as far as soldiers on the ground. Probabilities say that there's almost no way they can win the conventional war. However, in terms of fourth generation warfare, this could be a problem for the Russians for decades and decades. I mean, in the sense that not only would, without a legitimate settled peace with the involvement of both sides, you would have the likelihood of an internal insurgency, even against a Russian-backed Ukrainian government. But that there's very little incentive for the current government to make deals with Russia because its own right wing could easily take it out. And that kind of put things in a bind. What do you make of that, as it looks like Kiev is being slowly and completely surrounded?
So I think that let me sort of tackle the question about the Air Force first, and maybe this will get at one of the other important topics, which is the Western response. Although there are very concrete and specific, let me put it plainly, nuclear reasons why NATO is deterred from aggressively intervening or engaging conventionally with Russian forces, that possibility from a planning perspective cannot be entirely ruled out, as well as different types of hybrid, unconventional, sort of undeclared operations, maybe by special forces or other kinds of less overt units that Russia is keeping a portion of its military power in reserve, and not even in reserve around necessarily the Ukrainian theater, but around St. Petersburg, around the border with Finland, in its sort of northwestern zone. Also, you have to think about Kaliningrad as well, that little enclave on the Baltic Sea, surrounded by Poland and Lithuania. So there are territories that are quite vulnerable to NATO, even using unconventional conventional forces. If NATO were better at hybrid warfare, it might be able to sponsor a Kaliningrad People's Republic, which would secede from the Russian Federation. In order to prevent that kind of destabilization, or be ready in case there's just a break with expectations and NATO decides to expand the conflict, maybe thinking that it could conduct a first strike against Moscow and elements of the Russian nuclear arsenal, drive into St. Petersburg, and maybe that would finish it off. I don't think that's a sensible strategic plan. I don't think that's an accurate view, but you never know what neoconservative types in Washington might be able to push through bureaucratically. And that for those contingencies, having the Air Force in reserve, especially in that northern tier, makes sense, especially considering too that Putin is willing to absorb losses to his Ukrainian invasion force at a very high level. There's several reasons for this. One, looking at the prisoners that have been taken by the Ukrainians, looking at some of the equipment that's been destroyed, it appears that he's following an old Soviet strategy of throwing in weaker, less valuable units to wear down the enemy, take initial territory, use up enemy supplies of ammunition, use up enemy heavy weapons before sending in shock troops, before sending in elite forces to actually carry out the decisive operations. So that willingness to absorb losses, when we pivoting to fourth generation warfare, information warfare, controlling international narratives and trying to set the stage for the post-conflict. In some ways, having lopsided Russian losses in the Ukraine conflict, since Russia is the aggressor, can feed into a narrative that this was extraordinarily costly, that Russia was restrained because their losses were greater than the Ukrainian losses, that there's been a blood price paid, a sacrifice of many thousands of lives, which requires some form of victory in order to justify that human cost. So from a purely cold, ruthless strategic calculus, it's not a terrible way to conduct this operation, even if you are taking significant losses against the Ukrainians, so long as you're continuing to advance and they can't reverse your strategic momentum, which has been the case. Russia is continuing to reach its objectives. We don't know what their timetable is. There are many think pieces and many Pentagon-sourced intelligence leaks that say that Putin is frustrated, he's snapping at people, he's upset that this is a disappointment, that they should have been in Kiev by now. But the ones which aren't purely speculative are questionably sourced. So we don't even know if this is going worse than expected. So that's my view of certain parts of the conflict, pivoting to controlling the narrative, what you're describing as fourth generation warfare, hybrid warfare. We're seeing a great divergence in terms of the way that the war is discussed in the Western press and in the Russian media. The Russians essentially stress that strategically they continue to advance. They stress the far right elements inside the Ukrainian apparatus. They make claims of genocidal human rights violations by Ukrainian forces, which are grossly exaggerated, not fabricated. Which is not to say that, especially the right-wing elements in the Ukrainian military, the Azov battalion just being the most famous of several, haven't committed gross violations. Some military units, including the one led by the newly appointed mayor of Odessa, were found to have committed abuses in the Donbass by Ukrainian authorities. So there is abuse there, but not of the systemic, large-scale variety that could credibly be described as genocide.
Right. I think we need to separate out to the Russian grievances a little bit. You've talked about this before. I have thought about it a lot. Euromaidan is often brought up, and the right-wing element of that, and the right-wing element of the fighting of Euromaidan is real and sincere, because I mean, usually in a chaotic situation, it's right-wing groups who have militias who are already ready to fight. In fact, some left-wing groups were, quote, knifed out of the situation anyway. The current president of Ukraine, however, does not come from that. I mean, he's a Jewish comedian who is a native Russian speaker. Kind of a it's hard. I probably shouldn't make analogies to Russian figures, but if you took someone with the entertainment history of Trump and the centrist instincts of Macron, you'd have the president, whose name I'm not saying because yeah. Actually, that's even better. It's like Jon Stewart, but as Macron. That's the current president. But he has forces to his right.
Zelensky.
Yeah, Zelensky. You will see me struggle with Slavic names, even though I'm partially Bulgarian. But that's
barely Slavic.
Yeah, I know. I mean, we're probably Bulgar steppe peoples anyway. But my point in this is that the situation in Ukraine cannot be simplified to a right-wing or left-wing phenomenon. And similarly with the separatist republics, who have pretty strong Orthodox Christian impulses, as well as certain communist sympathies. They're all mixed in together. We could talk about I mean, there are frankly war criminals on both sides from the Bosnian War. So that needs to be kind of set aside, because there are minor I say minor atrocities as if they're not super, as if murder is ever minor, but on both sides of that. I mean, right? We haven't had murders of whole populations on either side as of yet. However, how do I put this? And Euromaidan also should be understood in the context not of NATO so much as which was what Putin Putin's messaging to Europe and outside press was later, but from the Russian sources that I understand, actually had to do with breaking up the economic bloc of a Eurasian union by offering
if I may, the specifics were that Yanukovych was negotiating with Lukashenko and Putin on a Eurasian union, which would include Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and essentially cement Ukraine as a appanage of the Russian Federation.
Correct.
There'd be upsides to Ukrainians. They'd be able to work and travel freely to Russia and Belarus, which is advantageous.
Have better standards of living than Ukraine.
Yes, and the Russian influence would also settle some of the most contentious political questions regarding security, regarding foreign policy. So, although it would not be good for things like press freedom or civil liberties or non-governmental groups, there would be a stabilization benefit. The negotiations were proceeding, and tactically, I think, to get a better deal, Yanukovych simultaneously opened negotiations with the European Union. As long as the negotiations proceeded, he could try to extract more concessions from Putin and just sweeten the deal. And if the Europeans pulled the plug, then he would also have an alibi with the Ukrainian people as to why he was siding with Russia. Something very unexpected happened, which is, with all the typical caveats and hedging and temporizing and long time horizons, the Europeans cleared Ukraine for potential accession and offered to open negotiations towards EU admission. The EU, much more than NATO, is the holy grail of post-socialist Eastern Europe.
Bingo.
The membership in an EU country for individuals permits travel across the continent. It permits work. It facilitates study. It allows businesses to operate in the common market. So it's very advantageous to Ukrainian entrepreneurs. The wage gains that would just come from Ukrainians being able to deliver pizzas in Berlin would be life-changing for the pizza delivery men. And the further looking at it structurally, the EU has a much more generous and robust transfer mechanism from rich countries, rich regions to poorer members than the United States. There's a mechanism explicitly for those kinds of regional development payments, which Ukraine, as a poor country, would immediately qualify for. The Common Agricultural Policy is a subsidy scheme, which makes the European Union very difficult for outside agricultural exporters to enter. But if you're on the inside and you have an acreage, you have even a relatively small arable land, you can claim generous subsidies, which, even when they're indexed down to local GDP, are a significant boon for that regular people can qualify for. And Poland demonstrated that even if you have a large non-modernized agricultural sector, by working strategically to qualify for other grants, by energetically changing your marketing, changing your production techniques, even small-scale farmers can survive the initial shock of EU imports and then become net recipients of CAP subsidies. This is on top of infrastructure. And from the perspective of Ukrainians living in the country, European countries that belong to the EU are governed better, have more rule of law, more stability. So there's hopes that EU membership might lead to what many, what is a dream for many post-socialist Eastern European countries, which is becoming a normal country
But
where things work.
Can I ask some questions in regards to that? Because I also, for people who don't know my background, I spent a lot of time in the Middle East as well. And I've spent a significant amount of time talking to people in Turkey back in the days where people thought Turkey might actually be able to get into the EU right before things, or right after things went to pot and grease, actually, is when I was there. I wasn't living there, but I made several trips there and talked to many people who spoke English, which does put them in a certain class. So I know that. But they felt, the fairly educated elites that I were talking to could talk to me in English, that in Turkey that they were strung along on the possibility of ever being in the EU, even though they wanted it in so much that it would, recognize Turkey as a European nation and live in which in a way actually has stuff going all the way back to the Ottomans for the legitimacy of their role in Europe. Part of it was blamed on that they weren't part of Christendom, part of it, historically, etc. Part of it was blamed on economic reasons. What's the likelihood that a similar situation happened with Ukraine?
100%.
Okay. Because I was like, that's what I felt too. I felt like it was a false promise.
So my reading, and I don't have the insider intelligence that could confirm it, was that most of the EU in their Ukraine negotiations were in sort of default globalizer mode, just repeating the mantras and nostrums of integration, capitalism, reform, etc., etc. And the only counterparties on the EU side that had an investment, that had a stake in the outcome of those early negotiations in 2013, were the Poles, that wanted to prevent the reversion of Ukraine to the Russian sphere of influence. And they were able to prevent the outcome of those negotiations from being a tepid no to a tepid yes. And that at that level, no decision has been made, because you begin talks just like you did with Turkey. That doesn't mean they're going to conclude favorably for the candidate country. Other members get to weigh in, right? Ireland could veto you for some reason, right? Sweden could, Greece could decide that this is their one and only opportunity to lock in an olive oil monopoly or something, right? It gets very messy when you actually begin the process. And there's all kinds of pretexts to either delay or conclude. It took 13 years for Poland to get in, from signing a association agreement to actual membership. And that was under very favorable conditions, relatively speaking.
So when we look at this, and this brings us back to Russia's real grievances here, Russia views this. I think when they say that they view the situation in Ukraine going all the way back to the Orange Revolution in the mid-aughts, as an attempt for the West to encircle them, either through the EU economically or through NATO militarily, that they're being sincere about that. That is not like the claims of genocide in the Ukraine. That this is a real and expected, frankly, grievance from the way we have handled them all the way back to deals made with Gorbachev in '89 over what we would do with Germany.
Well, I largely I concur sincerely on wholeheartedly on the NATO side, and especially the accession of the Baltic states moved the frontiers of NATO deep into um, the Russian sort of strategic depth. But the EU was traditionally seen, and we have the sort of diplomatic announcements and strategic documents to verify this, has been seen by Russia as much less of a problem, much less controversial. That an EU member state like Finland is still potentially neutralized from a strategic perspective.
Right.
And to a certain extent, uh, given that Russia and Ukraine are extremely close trading partners, billions, hundreds of billions of euros poured in to Ukraine for investment, for subsidies, for through remittances, actually have a spillover benefit for Russia economically. The resistance to the 2013 negotiations had more to do with the fact that now the EU was being presented as an alternative rather than an additive to any post-Soviet integration among what was once the Commonwealth of Independent States, what Russia considers its near abroad, right? If you could do the Eurasian Union and the European Union, that would be one thing, but it was clear that these two proposals were conflictive. And it wasn't just on the European side either, because by 2013, it was clear that the standard diplomatic tango of the West in the post-socialist space was offer the EU, deliver NATO. That's what happened with all of the accession countries. Before their EU membership was completed, they became members of NATO. And part of this, I don't think that it's entirely a sort of strategic master plan, but EU accession takes so long that frustration builds among the population, and elected governments need to show some kind of progress. They need to have something to show for all of the change, and some of it is quite difficult, that the Europeans require. The Europeans, and especially the United States, like NATO membership because it also plays well for them in their domestic politics. It's an easy statesman feather, statesman merit badge to claim. We on my watch, Albania became the 34th European NATO member, and that's what happens with Ukraine as well. The EU accession talks are immediately scuppered after the Maidan uprising, while not membership talks, because there's all kinds of reasons why that's also a false promise, and they're also being strung along. But the NATO connections, those actually deepen. There's military aid, there's training, there's also all of this rhetorical flourishes about protecting Ukraine, standing up for democracy, etc., etc. Very anti-Russian, and the Russians knew it. So in the case of Euromaidan, many people were mobilized. Many regular Ukrainians were mobilized in the hope that they could defend that possibility, that opportunity, that dream of EU membership. But they ultimately weren't being dealt with in good faith. That measure was going to be deeply unpopular under regular circumstances in all of Western Europe. And this is pre-Brexit, right? The Brexit demonstrated how frustrated.
Right. It's pre-Brexit, but post Greek crisis.
Yes.
And so that's a particular moment that I remember at the time thinking, I was actually sitting at a table in 2013 with a professor of Ukrainian language and two Greek students, and talking about the EU. And the Greek students were looking at the Ukrainian professor like, why on earth would you want to be in the year, and at least maybe I could see why you want to be in the the European
Why would you want to
Union,
be in the Eurozone?
but why in the hell would you want to be in the Eurozone? The best case scenario is Estonia, and the worst case scenario is Greece.
Well, yes,
So
but honestly,
that wasn't going to
Greece
happen,
did.
though, right?
Yes, yeah, and also the Greek crisis. Let's not lose sight of the fact that it was an incredible own goal by the Greek political establishment.
Oh yeah,
They did everything to bring about the economic, the financial ruin of their own country.
right. And then the replacement establishment also screwed it up. So
Yes,
so it's I mean, Syriza kind of epically shot itself in the foot as well.
I think, frankly, I think they were drawing dead, right?
Right.
That it was already too late. But even so, um, Greece is a worst case scenario, but not an inevitable one. Like you said, you could also be Estonia or Poland.
So what I'm trying to get my listeners to understand is from the average Ukrainian position, and I've talked to Ukrainian Americans and people from the Ukraine when I was in other countries. The promise of Europe through what they got a glimpse of from Poland for a good portion of the country looked like a good deal. But from the Russian standpoint, seeing how that had been used to expand NATO, where people never became part of the European Union in the first place, it looked like a bait and switch. So you have incentive structures immediately that are going to put people at odds that both sides are going to see as a problem. And I say this because I kind of get tired of people blaming this on foreign intelligence agencies as if the Russian intelligence agency and the CIA were somehow just secretly scheming to set all this up.
Masterminding.
Yeah, this is you can explain this pretty easily with looking at the incentives in the region. And then you have to add, and this is slightly psychologizing Putin and United Russia, but I will do so only in the sense that it was very live for me at the time too, because I was watching it from Korea, and then I would later spend time in Egypt, where I was on one side surrounded by Libya and Libyan refugees. I met Yemeni refugees every few days, and like half my neighborhood was either Chinese employers or Syrian refugees. So it was a very real thing for me why someone would fear this. So Putin's attitude towards the United States got slightly better when Obama in his pivot to Asia took a slightly we're going to readjust with Russia so that
Reset.
maybe reset things so we can kind of pry them away from China, honestly. And people don't realize that was Obama's policy, but that was. But Libya and Russia's ascension to Libya happening really seemed to have changed the strategy, and this gets solidified hard by Euromaidan. Like those two things together really seem to alter Russian geostrategic calculations. They didn't trust the United States by this point anyway. They had plenty of grievances about the Chicago boys, about all the bad advice they got during the Yeltsin period, about a bunch of bad deals they probably got. I mean, it's speculative, but people speculate about okay, so obviously the United States made some deal with Yeltsin during the Yugoslav wars to throw Milosevic to the wind, etc. And maybe those deals weren't honored. We don't know if they were ever made. I mean, so that is all speculation, but it's speculation I've heard from people who aren't stupid. So, that all these together really solidify Russia in a go-it-alone way. Then you have an oil crisis, which I know a lot of people on the left think was totally engineered by the United States. I don't. I think Saudi interest against undermining Iran played into it, and it just happened to co-align with part of a U.S. interest. But it also hurt some U.S. interests. But it totally takes out a lot of the oil price market in energy stuff for Russia too, around the same time. This puts them in a very bad situation. And I don't know. I mean, while I will tell you that I think, I think all the regimes here are right wing, and you shouldn't trust what any of them are saying from their official standpoints. I mean, as a kind of bias, I understand exactly why Russia would have been making the calculations that it was making, um, because it looks pretty bad. Um,
Well,
Furthermore, Brexit fell apart. I mean, not Brexit. The BRICS fell apart, which we can talk about that too. So,
I just want to pick up on a couple of things that you were saying.
mm,
The one of the expectations of Russia following the end of the Cold War, which, according to the Russian narrative, it's not that Reagan wins the Cold War, the United States wins the Cold War. It's that the Soviet people, recognizing the bankruptcy of their system, end the Cold War through their dismantling of the Soviet security and political apparatus, and kind of opening the jail of the peoples that had been the Eastern Bloc. And they weren't necessarily expecting a Nobel Peace Prize. One would have been nice, but what they were expecting was to be treated like a partner, in a junior partner. They understand power politics, but a partner nonetheless in the global fora where security, geopolitical, economic issues are settled. This is why the admission of Russia to the G7 was such a big deal in the 90s. It was a bone that was thrown to Russia because it really didn't have the economic heft to justify entry. And all of that, you had to go along to try to satisfy those expectations. You had the creation of things like the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, which was supposed to be the sort of non-Western, non-American centric security talking shop parallel to NATO. And there was always a profound faith in the United Nations, and the two things which were supposed to secure Russia's position in the world was its nuclear weapons and its UN Security Council seat. When American interests were being channeled through those institutions, you mentioned Yeltsin selling out Milosevic. Well, when the Dayton Accord was signed and the measures were approved to take steps in the Yugoslav, Bosnian, the Yugoslav Civil War, the secessionists, the conflict between the secessionist states, the genocide in Bosnia, Russia went along with that. When it put its foot down with respect to Kosovo and threatened a UN Security Council veto, they expected that it would be honored. They expected that the same consideration, the same deference to multilateral institutions would be shown by the winning side, even if it's just a gesture of magnanimity, even if it's just to sort of keep the thing going. Instead, Tony Blair and Bill Clinton opt to use NATO outside of any global multilateral organizations as the axe with which to cut down Serbia, and thus avoid any entanglement, any veto point that Russia had, or any input point that Russia had. This was considered to be an outrageous betrayal by virtually everyone in Russia. Here we see that the Americans really are as bad as we had always been told. They are not being magnanimous. They are treating us like losers. They're completely disregarding our voice. And Yeltsin went so far as to engage in some adventurism by sending Russian troops to capture the airport in Pristina ahead of the NATO advance. That, from his perspective, would demonstrate that Russia still had some capabilities. It still had to be reckoned with, and maybe it would wake up the NATO powers. They made a mistake. Instead, the first instinct, and I know this from after the fact autobiographies published by some of the NATO officers involved, was to treat the Russians as hostiles, and they sought to potentially expel them by force. Instead, you had a very tense standoff before Yeltsin pulled them out in a humiliating climb down, and NATO did whatever it wanted anyway. The Libya invasion was in many ways a replay where there is a Security Council resolution that Putin has approved, but from a no-fly zone kind of humanitarian hands-off approach, which is what the resolution called for. It was supposed to prevent a genocide in Benghazi. That was the justification for any kind of involvement by international forces. NATO pivoted without consultation to a regime change strategy, a regime change goal. So, once bitten, twice shy.
And
this
one that
is
had
twice
horrible
Yes, exactly.
repercussions in North Africa. Like
Exactly.
Libya is still barely a functioning state.
In addition to all the arguments about NATO perfidy, Russia also has a strong case to make that the United States, in practicing hegemony, is guilty of incompetence, malpractice. That if you look at the fruits of American unipolarity, it's catastrophe after catastrophe in one country after another.
Which is their argument for multipolarity, which it's a word I use advisedly because it has a geopolitical meaning that you can find back in even American books, all the way back to stupid books like Fareed Zakaria's, but also has a very specific meaning with a specific faction of United Russia. However, one of the arguments they'll make for unipolarity is that Atlantis' dominance has allowed the Americans to be decadent and not competent in their rule of the world. It's an argument that I say, we can get into. In fact, I do want to get into the grievances with Russia that Ukraine may have that's legitimate, but it's one of those things where I'm like, well, do you have evidence that they're wrong? There are, however, some things that I found that I still find somewhat worrying about the tactics and strategies. And I was going to mention people should read William Lynn's Fourth Generation Warfare book and about hybrid warfare, and also insurgencies and losses, because sometimes I think we think that only applies to the United States. But that research applies to all occupations. And by that, I mean, this can become a long, bloody, bitter affair, even if NATO never does anything beyond this point. And frankly, it's going to lead to massive blowback on the West, not just from the Russian side, I think, but frankly, from the Ukrainian side, because no faction of Ukrainian politics is going to trust us after we hang them out to dry, which we are almost inevitably going to do. I could be wrong on that. I hate saying inevitable, but it seems like, well, your options are that or nuclear war. So, I think before we get into, let's get into this from the Ukrainian perspective, though, from the perspective of people being frustrated with the elected, but not particularly competent, frankly, Russian-friendly governments in the Ukraine, and a feeling that Russia was being a little bit too heavy-handed with them in the region, and their rejection of the Russian nationalist narrative of them being really part of Russia, going all the way back to Kiev and Rush. What are the legitimate beefs that the Ukrainians may have with Russian hegemony in their region?
So there's an important cleavage. There's several important cleavages within Ukraine. The borders that were established for the post-Soviet state were internal administrative lines drawn more or less arbitrarily by the Soviet Union, including Ukrainian possession of Crimea, which
was given to them by Khrushchev in the 50s. But also, no one thought that the Soviet Union was not going to exist unless this would become a problem. So
exactly, precisely. Those borders were not well considered because they were also not treated particularly seriously, and but so we have this vast territory which includes the Crimea that had never been Ukrainian ever. It includes Novorossiya, which is the name of the region to the west of Crimea along the Black Sea, with Odessa as its principal city, which had also never been Ukrainian. It had been a no man's land between Poland, the Ottomans, and the Crimean Khanate, which had been depopulated by Tatar slave raids and Turco-Russian, Turco-Polish warfare. There was nothing there, very few towns, very little development, very little settlement. It's too dangerous until Catherine the Great conquered that region, integrated the Crimea and its associated territories, and built Odessa, which was settled largely by Jews and ethnic Russians from the center, rather than Ukrainians from further north. The in area that could be called Ukraine proper, that historically had things like the Zaporozhye Sich or the Kievan Rus, or these pre-modern proto-states, which with a Ukrainian identity. There's two important cleavages. One is between the Donbass and everything to the west, and the other is between Western Ukraine, sometimes referred to as Galicia, and everything to the east.
Because Galicia was part of Poland for longer than the rest of the Ukraine.
Exactly. So as if you, I'm not going to rehash medieval history, but the Ukraine, the word itself means hinterland or border region or frontier, and it was the triple line between southern Muslims or steppe peoples, Western Slavs and Lithuanians, and Eastern Slavs and Russians. And that those lines and the states that dominated would change over time.
Yeah, the Ruthians, this and the other, yeah.
Exactly. And the biggest, the most recent of those developments was the collapse of the Russian Empire, the emergence of an independent Poland, and the Russo-Soviet War, the Soviet-Polish War, which established the eastern frontier of Poland and the borders of the USSR. A large portion of Ukraine, the city of Lviv, Ivano-Frankovsk, Vinnytsia, all of this, the western area, and large parts of Belarus as well, were part of the Polish Second Republic after World War II, after World War I. And as a result, they had one generation, maybe two generations less of the Soviet Union. And in that generation, you had Stalin and the hunger death in the East, forced industrialization, agricultural collectivization, which were all extremely costly and devastating for the traditional Ukrainian peasantry that lived in that area.
And while there's no marching order of like a removal of this of the Ukrainians as a minority, that you do have actually with certain other minorities in the Stalin period of Russia, it is clear that they were disproportionately hit by grain requisitions and basically a massive industrialization process for which it for some reason fell on their shoulders more than others. Yeah,
I'm willing to give the Russians and the Soviets a break here, because it largely had to do with the fact that Ukraine was much more productive than northern Russia. And if you need to grab the grain, you have to go where the grain is. The grain was in Ukraine. The grain was in Ukraine. And But whatever the reasons, like you said, it was disproportionately affecting Ukrainians that read it partly as an ethnic animus. Many of those who felt that way in Ukraine just didn't survive because of hunger and World War II and the suspicion of the NKVD and the Communist Party apparatus of Ukrainians that complain or that don't complain. The descendants of those Ukrainians in the Polish partition didn't go through that experience, but watched what happened to Ukrainians under Soviet domination. And they also ethnicized it, that it was Russians doing this to their people. And that is one reason why the far right is strongest in Western Ukraine. That region, they don't particularly like Poles in Western Ukraine either. There was a genocide conducted by Ukrainian irregular forces, the Banderites.
Yeah, I was about to say Bandera led. He wasn't just getting rid of Jews; he was also getting rid of Poles. And
yes,
even
tens
though
of thousands,
right, even though he was, part of Polish, part of Polish Ukraine in quotation marks.
Exactly.
And I mean, I do think, we have to admit that the Soviet borders were added a whole bunch of small regions to the traditional Ruthian Ukrainian area that created, it could have gone. It could have gone more like Yugoslavia than it did, frankly.
Yes, and all of this is by lengthy preface to say that different regions and different identity groups within this post-Soviet Ukraine have different interests and different grievances, and they also don't particularly or necessarily like one another. And the during the post-Soviet phase, although there was no active Russification policy, the de facto reality was that Russian was the lingua franca and Ukrainian was a regional dialect, which rubbed the Ukrainian nationalists the wrong way because this was supposed to be a renaissance of the nation. Why are we all speaking Russian? Why are we all still speaking Russian?
This happened in a lot of the new nationalized states when Stalin kind of changed his policies on nation from his 1928 plus respecting of Lenin's policies to what he changed it with during the quote Great Patriotic War unquote. So yeah, okay, makes sense.
And the all geographically too, there in Western Ukraine, you want to have greater economic integration with Poland because that's where customers, consumers, job opportunities, trade opportunities lie. In the East, it's precisely the opposite. Meanwhile, in Crimea, which had been a jewel of the Soviet Union and had a very powerful place in the Russian imagination, both as a kind of Hawaiian vacation getaway locale, their little slice of paradise, and also as a symbol of their victory against the Tatars, which had been slaving through the Slavic heartland for 500 years up until that point. So the Crimeans had very little affinity with Ukraine. It was a largely Russophone, largely ethnic Russian population there. The Donbass, the residents there were the descendants largely of ethnic Russians from the center that had been moved during the Soviet period for job opportunities and to work in the heavy industry that was stood up in that region. So they were more closely connected with Russia than potentially even to the rest of Ukraine, let alone to Lviv or Galicia. And with the economic connections, you also have political interests, right? Donbass would lose if there were supply chain reorganization westwards, and Galicia would remain agricultural and undeveloped without that type of shift. You have different civil society groups in the east, in Crimea, in Odessa, in Novorossiya, The germ of associations, political and otherwise, was the post-Soviet groups, which is why you still have some legacy political parties and legacy leftists. While the germ of political association in Galicia was Ukrainian nationalist groups.
Mm-hmm.
You also have a religious cleavage on top of everything between Uniate Orthodox, Uniate Ukrainian Orthodox, which belong to the
The
Roman
Byzantine Catholic order. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Russian Orthodox, compounded by a more recent schism supported by the U.S., but likely not engineered by it, to make the Ukrainian Orthodox Church autocephalous and remove it from the authority of the Patriarchate in Moscow.
Yeah.
So
and it was it's actually been my family's divided in the Orthodox and the Jewish world, and it's actually a pretty big deal that now that like there's a semi-schism between the Patriarch of Constantinople, who supported
the grant of autocephaly,
right,
and Moscow,
and Moscow, which is a schism in the Orthodox world, which they happen all the time, but this one looks like it might stick a while. So
yes. This one's going to be hard to paper over because it falls on these other cleavages.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody wants Kiev and doesn't want the other guy to have it.
Right.
So no political leader in Ukraine, in the post-Soviet Ukraine, could possibly balance all of these regional interests, identitarian interests, successfully. You had to be on one side or the other. And that's what we see with the Orange Revolution in Euromaidan. The legitimate different interests of Western Ukrainians, of those that want closer integration with the West, of those who are suspicious of Russia, that resent Russian meddling, and that are dubious about both the intentions and the ability of Russia to manage any kind of regional development. People also don't want to end up like Belarus, which is seen as maybe stable, but it's the stability of the prism. And it also isolated from Europe. During the Orange Revolution in Euromaidan, those legitimate concerns and those legitimate interests boiled over into the ouster of established governments. In the Orange Revolution, it's completely unclear who won that election. It
Right.
could very well be that Yanukovych lost and it was fabricated. And one thing that is true, certainly seems to be true, is that Yushchenko was poisoned with polonium.
Right.
And that's a pretty big deal, right? Like, you do not have to be a Nazi to be upset that a foreign leader tried to kill one of your domestic political leaders with radioactive poison. That's kind of
a little bit of a big
impolite.
deal. I mean,
unneighborly.
If it's say a larger country, that would be an act of war. Just
Yes.
putting that out there. So I mean, so we have a situation where
But there's one other thing that I want to add here, which is in 2014, the moves that Putin makes, capturing Crimea and severing the separatist regions in the Donbass, actually reconfigure the rump of Ukraine by removing the most Russophilic, the most connected to Russia segments of the population by millions of people, therefore leaving behind a Ukraine that is more Western, more nationalist, less likely to seek an accommodation with Russia, and more likely to favor the West. So in a lot of ways, those decisions made in 2014 by Russia undermined their own ability to influence domestic political events in Ukraine in their favor. They basically guaranteed that following that subsequent democratic governments would always lean towards the West.
Right. I mean, and in some ways, Navalny is an interesting figure in that he is really, truly a centrist figure in this. And
Navalny or Zelensky?
Zelensky, excuse me, not Navalny. Anyway, Zelensky, as opposed to like you have a decade of the Yanukovych, Cinco, the back and forth and this, that, and the other, and Yushchenko, yes. Feel free to correct my pronunciation of anything. So Yushchenko going basically. I mean, if you just look at the elections, you have this turn on. I'm not quite sure what's determining the turn either. Like what is it? Are there people in the middle of Ukraine who are literally geographically in the middle and just kind of going one way or the other? I've talked to Ukrainians and I haven't gotten an answer to that.
So there's areas like it's a little like the United States, where if you look at a map, blue and red, it looks like these very hard, sharp lines, but then you dig into Pennsylvania and it's 50-50.
Right. Okay.
So there's some of that, especially in the center of the country. And this is partly a residue of the long period of peaceful and fraternal coexistence during the post-Stalin Soviet period, where Ukrainians are no longer terrified of being deported or brutalized. And those that live in the center, where there's opportunity, not just opportunity for social or economic advancement, but opportunity to meet hot Russian chicks, right?
Mhm.
Like they intermarry, they form families. The de-emphasizing religion also removes one of the barriers for fraternization, and you have a hybrid identity, like the Yugoslav identity that was real for a lot of people in Sarajevo, a lot of people in Bosnia, some fewer people in Belgrade and Zagreb, but many people in Ukraine. And you see this with the numbers that identify as Ukrainian by ethnicity, but are Russophone. So there is this large, but shrinking segment of the population that has both a claim to Russian identity and a claim to Ukrainian identity, don't like being forced to pick one, and typically their attitude is one of pragmatism, which is, look, it would be great if they let us in the EU. They won't. If I can't have London, Moscow's not so bad, right? At least that's something. I'm not going to burn this whole thing down if I can't get my number one selection. And we're also kind of Russian, right? We can understand each other. There's good reasons why integration with Russia might make sense. So those are the persuadables. And I thought that they would remain persuadable with following the Russian entry, that their dissatisfaction and disgust with the post-Maidan governments, with the rampant corruption and ineptitude of their own system, might make them not side with Russia, but sit it out, right? Or go through the motions. It looks like what actually happened is that the stark fact of foreign invaders coming in to take your home has galvanized Ukrainian identity, especially in this large sort of movable, reconcilable population, where they have decisively, at least for the time being, decided that the Ukrainian local identity is one worth protecting and worth defending.
Yeah. There have been some discussions about the attack on the Union headquarters, which, while in Odessa, yeah, which I do want to address. While serious, it claiming that non-state actors engaging in a terrorist attack, effectively, on a group, amounts to a systemic genocide is kind of a joke. So that's a stretch. It's real. Just like, I mean, people bring up all the they should actually, there are more right-wing battalions than the Azov, before I butcher another thing. Battalion. There are actually more right-wing groups in Ukraine. There's the
IDAR
Wolves,
battalion,
yeah.
I think, is the one that actually conducted the killings in Odessa of the
Right.
union activists.
And as I mentioned, there are also some pretty, by almost anyone's standards, right-wing elements in the separatist republics as well. That game is not particularly interesting to me, even though we have to acknowledge it as real. It seems to me like
well, let me just chime in for 1 second, which is to say, as a Pole, as an Eastern European, as somebody, my family, I was, I realized that speaking the way I do, I seem less immigrant-y than I am, but my home culture, my home life, my parents is entirely Polish. And my upbringing, my intellectual upbringing, my father's a professor, was through the Polish lens. And when it comes to political identity, and when it comes to the orientation of states, ethno-nationalism is extraordinarily influential, hegemonic even, or at least a candidate for hegemony in Eastern European countries,
right,
especially among the titular nationalities. Minorities like Jewish people or Russians in Estonia and in the Baltic states, of course, have different perspectives, but among the titular nationalities, especially ones that have traumatic histories through the Soviet period and World War II, there's a profound belief in the naturalness of these quasi-tribal ethnic identities, that this is who we are. And therefore, you have very fertile soil for that orientation to take on. Yeah, basically, if you're inoculated with a very strong commitment to civic democracy, then that ethno-nationalism can become more democratic focused, more procedural, more constitutional, with recognition of the individual rights of minorities. And it's okay. But once you've shed any affinity for constitutional democratic values, yeah, you're very close to being recruitable or persuadable by the far right. So it is no surprise that you have these elements, and they exist everywhere in the whole region. Like, look at Jobbik in Hungary, and that's something that those cultures and those the locals will have to struggle with. But because it's so broad, saying, "Oh, look, there's Nazis, therefore these must be bad people," you could do that.
I mean, you could do that, frankly, anywhere. I mean, like, I've lived in non-European nations that had Nazis, but and actually, the biggest encounter I've ever had with Nazis was in northern Mexico. But I think I have a theory about that, actually, and I'll just throw it out. We don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but that part of this is the experience of modernization and nationalization in Eastern Europe happens so late. That it's almost within living memory, even though there's a long history of proto nations in the region going all the way back for like 1,000 years. That the modern nation state is such a new thing, and they didn't get the Soviet experiment solidified national identity, but didn't solidify national autonomy. Really, they kept on cutting back what that meant. So it's still a fresh thing. Whereas, like, those of us from places that have had nation states for 500-600 years, it seems kind of like we've developed past that. And it's easy to feel that way too, because there's no, there's not as many active regionalisms where we've killed each other. I mean, there are. I mean, for example, like I'm a Southerner from the United States. I know I don't have the accent anymore, and all this, and I'm actually not from the normal ethnicities of Southern people. My family is like Scotch Irish and Bulgarian and North African, but Scotch Irish Welsh and Bulgarian and North African. But it's I still feel like every now and then, like, even though objectively I think the Civil War, you know, the North were clearly the good guys, etc. Culturally, I am defensive around most of the rest of the United States, and sometimes to the point where I do not identify with them at all. And that's in a place that doesn't have a strong tradition of ethno-nationalism because it's a settler state, and that doesn't make sense.
And you're white.
Yeah. You know. Well, yes, and I'm white. I look white. Any non-white heritage is not visible to somebody.
Well,
so
during World War II, which is, you know, my grandparents' generation, your ethnic identity determined whether or not you were slated for extermination by one or the other of the totalitarianisms. And it's not just the Jewish minority either, but
no, it's Poles, it's all kinds of people. I mean,
yes.
Poles get the shit in it. We kind of erase, like, everyone's always like, well, Putin's super reactionary. I'm like, I wonder why. Like seriously, I wonder why. Who hasn't tried to wipe them out in the 20th century? Like, only
the Americans, actually.
Yeah, and it's because you're so far away.
Yes.
So, it's, I say this with the amount of, like, we have to understand these conflicts with this lens in mind, and it makes it impossible to not recognize some of the Russian grievances, but also say, I completely understand why Ukrainians may die on this hill. And I mean that sadly, literally at this point. And so, you know, it's horrifying to me that, but it's something where the way I see people talk about this betrays a unsophisticated, frankly, cartoonish view of the way geopolitics works. And now this leads me to pivot to what else I want to talk about. The sanctions on Russia were fairly light in the beginning, but we were only 5 days in. They no longer seem light. After the removal from SWIFT, things seem a lot more serious. I've seen people posit that this will lead to global de-dollarization. I think they are maybe right in the long run, but if they think that's going to be enough to change things in the immediate future, they don't understand how production cycles work. And they don't really understand why Russia has not been able to do what China's been able to do in counter-asserting to the West, unquote. The other thing I think is going to be interesting that we have to look at is the food instability this is going to bring to places like India, North Africa, Egypt, which, you know, my former home, Egypt, even Brazil, which does kind of rhyme with the BRICS countries. I was laughing at the anti-fascist conference when they were inviting India. That's funny, but regardless, it makes sense from the coalition of food needs. But, and I do think, for those of you who think I think the dollar is hegemonic, I don't think that. I think this actually accelerates the decline of the dollar as an international currency, but nowhere near on the time scale that people
not fast enough for it to be relevant for this conflict.
Right. However, I do think that these sanctions cannot not hurt the common people in both countries. For the standpoint of it, you want to make the average Russian person, even if they're against this war, and from what I understand, it's hard to get a gauge of popular opinion in Russia. The Russian attitude towards this war is meh. You don't see the outbreak. It doesn't even seem as clear cut from what I'm getting as like the Georgian war was, where there was a lot of local Russian support. However, starving them by removing access to and having, I mean, the rubles plummeted overnight. I can't think of a better way to lead to a generation. If you think Putin and United Russia is bad now, like, well, what replaces Putin after this is something that you really, I mean, like, I don't like making World War I and World War II references, but I do have to say, like, think about Germany. Just think about Germany after World War I. Just think about it for a second. The other thing I would say is, if Germany itself, to bring up Germany, I saw in articles like Germany has chosen freedom over infinite prosperity. I'm like, okay, it may have, but what this means is the umbrella of American influence on Europe is going to weaken if Germany rearms. There's no way that doesn't happen, even if Germany does not enter into trade with Russia, which on the long term, I don't know how it doesn't, because even if it was to reestablish its nuclear capacity for nuclear power, like immediately, it would immediately is still in the terms of probably 5 years to a decade at most. I mean, at least. So, and they have cold winters coming soon. So I don't see how those sanctions are maintained. They might find backdoor ways around them in small ways through, the way everybody does. Well, I also have been interested in China's deft negotiation of this. On one hand, signaling to Russia it would support them. On the other hand, not fully committing to that in a public way, which is both easy for them in terms of the Security Council. They know Russia's going to veto it anyway. But also they do need trade. Like China and the United States and Europe have yes, those are the three biggest production hubs in the world. Yes, they could kind of subsist on their own, sorta, but they're totally integrated. So while China will not undermine Russia, it's going to definitely trade with food. There are bank sanctions it's going to respect, even if it is sympathetic to Russia's claims for national security. And also China has its own geopolitical claims, of which if it openly backed the invasion of Ukraine, it would be undermining. So I see this in the long run lead to more multipolarity, even if it does not maybe lead to a Russia that is economically stronger in the long run.
Well,
do you agree with that assessment? Like,
I do diverge from it in a few areas.
Okay.
I think it's too soon to tell about the sanctions. We're still in the phase of bandwagoning and nationalist fervor and Ukrainian triumphalism. So whatever is announced, we also have to verify that it's followed through. And like you said, with sanctions, there's all kinds of ways to make them porous, even when they're technically in place.
Correct.
Things like shutting Russia out of airspace, those are major steps because they're verifiable, they're immediate, and they impact a large cross-section of activity, large numbers of people. So we'll see how long they stay in place. And if they do stay in place for a longer period of time, that's going to signal a real seriousness about isolating Russia, and it will change the direction of Russian culture and society. When it comes to immiseration in Russia, Russia will not go the route of Iraq.
Oh, for sure. No, it has its own food, if minimum. Right?
Exactly. It has its own food. It had one of the first COVID vaccines. It has much of the technical and human capital necessary for some level of quasi-Soviet autarky. It won't run a command economy on the old Soviet model, but it can meet the needs of its population without compromising their ability to survive.
Right, particularly with some trade, with some limited trade within the grounds of formal sanctions with China and India.
Yes, and frankly, I think that just as we saw with the sanctions imposed after the seizure of Crimea on things like agriculture. Post-Soviet agriculture in Russia was one of the most dismal sectors in the economy because of the long legacy, the damage done by collectivization, which is extraordinarily destructive policy. And cheap food imports from the Eurozone, from Europe, the EU rather, undermined investment in reviving that sector. Once those were cut off, then you have conditions for a rebound in Russian agriculture, which is what you've seen. And I think that you are going to have very sharp nominal decline in GDP, but once there's adjustments for domestic production, local sourcing, there's actually might be a stabilization at a relatively reasonable human level of consumption. And all of this will be supplemented. Whatever Russia can make for itself will be supplemented by its trade with China. China is the world's foundry. China is the world's factory. If you have to lose a trading partner, the EU hurts, the United States hurts, but China is actually the essential one.
Right.
And the Belt and Road Initiative and all of the investments that have been made in continental trade routes, continental infrastructure, make it much more viable to deliver manufactured products from the factories in Western China and the Pearl River Delta all the way to the Russian heartland. It as of before the war, rail transport was still more expensive than ship transport, but it was becoming competitive. So now you have incredible demand in place for the rail system. You also potentially have the opening of the Northeast Passage for shipping, at least for part of the year. So I actually think that there's going to be a reorientation of economic exchange from along this Eurasian axis, which will mitigate some of the most severe consequences of the sanctions.
I do agree with that, but I think that'll take a little while to really coalesce.
Yeah, I mean, yes, this is true. Even for gas, right? All of the pipelines go west. So to sell its energy to China will require a major investment in that infrastructure. Although, you know, under conditions of this kind of economic collapse, Keynesian infrastructure investment, a jobs program, building all of this infrastructure, you have the heavy industry domestically, that actually may also be a way of addressing
I've been wondering about
economic
this
fallout.
because I've been thinking about how Russia has not, in this entire time, actually, and you know, since '92, it has had some successes in energy extraction, but I think it's probably led it to underdevelop its industrial sector, because Russian products, even in Africa, are not super common. Yes, I can find Soviet ladas everywhere when I was in Egypt, but like, I was actually thinking about, in all my travels around the world, how rare it is for me to encounter but a few luxury goods from Russia. That could change, and it should change. And if the United States was to, for example, come to the realization of even the UK in the 1940s, which the UK came only kicking and screaming through a Second World War too, but whatever. This would not necessarily be bad for any party in the system. I mean, I do think, for example, multipolarity is dangerous. It is dangerous because it can induce imperial conflicts. But it also, if there is actual treating of the poles as relative equals, and like we have historical examples
As
of
a
this.
poll, I would strongly support that.
Right. You know, I think we do have to, like, you know me in nation states, but in so much that nation states exist, this is a world that we have to live in, and these are the regional powers. I have been a little shocked at Putin's strategic rashness this time. It is very different than in the past, and I do think that needs to be commented on. He, even in his rhetoric, there's been a massive change from pre-COVID Putin. I mean, even when he was doing aggressive things in the past, it was always underplayed. It was always, he said less, not more. This has not been the time. So there does seem to be some level of deep frustration coming out of Moscow that is very serious. I'd also like to, I worry about this actually, as far as like intelligence goes. The United States intelligence apparatus, which is usually known for making shit up, are frankly, it is looks good right now on the world stage, and that is also strange. And a change of the recent 20-year history. I mean, we're talking about people, and I'm not just talking about the obviousness of the Iraq War. I'm talking about like accidentally blowing up the Chinese embassy and the Yugoslav War, which I do really believe was an accident, and and stuff like that. It actually played itself remarkably well in this scenario. But economically speaking, I think I think this has to be acknowledged, whether you look at it from the Biden stance and the Trump stance. If you cut the fog of internal American discourse and all the bullshit in the press, it does seem like there has been some realization of the limits of American power in the last 5 years. If they really believe it, however, if the brass believes it, is an entirely different notion. And it is very clear to me that some of the worst ghouls in the neoconservative foreign policy complex have benefited from these events.
They always do.
I know, it's really frustrating. I mean, and this has been the problem when talking about any of these events. And we talked about this on another episode. Intelligence and militarization ghouls go to legitimate civil disruption like flies to shit. Mm-hmm. When I say legitimate civil disruption, a lot of people in the West, and not just in the West, view all these actions as somehow orchestrated by intelligence organizations, where I have the opposite thing. I'm like, anytime there's going to be anything legitimate opening up, there's going to be intelligence organizations and whatever there. And you know, it was one of my things where when people would talk about Russiagate, and I'd be like, of course Russiagate is bullshit in the grand scheme. It didn't matter. But of course people were doing intelligence shenanigans in a highly divisive U.S. election. Well, duh. Like,
also, for instance, on the American far left, you had COINTELPRO and you had informants and operatives in organizations like the Nation of Islam, organizations like the Black Panthers. Mm-hmm. Are we going to say that those were astroturfed? Obviously not. And that's a similar experience in a lot of other countries where, like you said, those intelligence operatives are attracted to legitimate groups because that's where the action is. It's actually much harder to have a completely artificial front and do anything with that, because it's just you and your 12 buddies from Langley trying to get people on the street to join. Much better to hijack a real movement. And I just want to circle back on some of what you were sort of discussing about the multipolarity, and maybe I can lay out a scenario which I think is not entirely fanciful. I'm not going to say that this is how it plays out, but sort of potentially the best case scenario that I believe could happen, which would, you know, I realize that I talk about him too much, but Macron is one of the few global leaders, especially out of the West, that has a proficiency as a diplomat and an instinct towards diplomatic opportunities. And he's stayed talking to Putin while everybody else is trying to gin up conflict. On a phone call with Macron, Putin laid out his three essential conditions that a Ukrainian settlement must meet. One was recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea. The second was neutrality for Ukraine, and the third was denazification, demilitarization. The third one, of course, who knows what that means? That's absolutely, you could fit a poison pill in that one without even trying. But as a package, these aren't outrageous. These aren't designed to fail. If you have Ukrainian exhaustion caused by the encirclement of cities, Russian exhaustion caused by losses, together with the impact of sanctions, you might be able to reach some kind of settlement for a ceasefire or a freeze along those lines, which are proposals that have been made before the conflict. And after a decent interval and some confidence building measures, you could cement that deal with a peace council, peace conference, which would create a new continental European security order, which would provide Russia with a meaningful seat. Now, one you've also mentioned that Putin has been much more aggressive, and part of it, I think, is that it's mask off, that he's been choking down a lot of his anger for decades at this point, and now that there's nothing left to lose, he's venting. It's also possible that this very rash, very bold, but also decisive move may reflect the legacy concerns of an aging autocrat. If he could regather the Ukrainian lands in one way or another as the final step in his Russian restoration, he could retire. And 2024 is nominally the next Russian election, I believe. And one of the prerequisites of peace on the Western side will probably be that Putin can no longer rule. If he's planning on going out anyway, then he may
70,
be.
So.
Yes, he's 70. I mean, granted, like Yuri Andropov, Chernenko, Brezhnev all died in office. But one of the plays of a responsible autocrat is actually giving time, a la Deng Xiaoping, for you to become chairman of a bridge club and somebody else to take the reins, but you're still around for consultations, you still have your networks, you still have influence, and therefore that creates a mitigated transition.
What you don't want is a Stalin dying in his bed, squabble for central authority. I think
movie.
Yeah, exactly. One thing I would say also is Putin, and I have said before that this seemed out of character for him, but Putin also has been the great balancer to the frustration of idiots in the West who think Alexander Dugin is a major influencer, which at one time he may have been, but he has not since he was removed from his professorship. But there are different factions within United Russia, which he has politically played off of each other, and he has been able to maintain oligarchs. And he's been, I mean, to call them oligarchs is actually kind of interesting because they've been largely, even though it does seem like he's consolidated power in its person, because he's been able to play to balance different factions off of each other. And so,
not even off of each other, but the he has a power base in the security apparatus in the FSB, of course, but with oligarchs, and with regional governors, etc., with parliamentary forces, he's broken the ability to horizontally organize as a bloc, because ultimately your security, your actual physical security, forget your position, forget your fortune, depend on your connection, first or second order removed, to
right.
Putin. At any moment, and in ways similar to China, he doesn't care day by day what you do, whether you abuse your power, whether you use it well, whether you are nice to the gays, whether you're mean to them. But when the diktat comes, you have to obey.
Right.
And
Yeah. And I also think we have to like realize that a lot of these factions in Russian politics are regional more than ideological. It's very similar to what you see in China. Although I would also say the Politburo in China is a fairly diverse ideological group. It's just that it seems completely opaque to non-Chinese people or people who don't study China, which I know better than Russia.
no, there isn't. Putin hasn't assembled a Politburo. His autocracy is more autocratic and not conciliar. There isn't a collective leadership in Russia anymore,
Right.
and that's partly to avoid. It's a security measure for Putin, and also to avoid the potential for fragmentation during this reconsolidation
Right.
process.
I mean, because there are old tensions that if someone was, I mean, what Putin fears is, and I mean, he said it, so this is not me psychologizing, is the West being able to use internal divisions to completely break up Russia entirely.
Mhm.
And that is what he absolutely does not want. And I could see a bunch of deals coming out of this because ultimately, most of these people in the past have been rational actors. And while it is very interesting that France has played the particular role that it's played, on one hand, it's also the people who've delivered the counter-nuclear threat. On the other hand, it's been the people actually reaching out to Russia this entire time. And it does seem that Macron, who is a shit president of France itself, does see the interest in having Europe regain its autonomy from the United States, but not in a hostile manner.
Yeah, no, just kick him upstairs to the Council of Europe already, right?
Yeah,
Like,
and get France a decent president. I don't know.
yes,
Who knows if there is one in France, but like,
yeah. It would be a shame to lose Macron as a diplomat.
right.
Not because I'm ideologically simpatico with him, but the pool of candidates is so low, and these are matters of global peace, right? This is really, really important. Just to have one person who's good at their job would be
Right.
an improvement, and
And
it would.
and right now I'm at the point where I actually trust U.S. military figures more than I mean, and I mean like generals, not
Not,
neoconservative
yeah, not,
ghouls.
exactly, not
To
the
be more
Heritage
right, not the Heritage Foundation or even parts of the Democratic coalition, frankly.
Oh yeah,
Uh, I trust them
Democratic
more.
hawks are the worst.
Right, and we're gonna have more of them now.
Yes.
But I trust them more with America than I do anybody in the possible electoral future in the near future. And in that sense, I'm not super hopeful. There's a lot of other effects we'll talk about. I will say that also Biden has not handled this as badly as I feared he would. But it is yet to
Give
be
him
over.
time.
We could go. But I also must say that American liberals have lost their damn mind if they think the U.S. is going to apply a no-fly zone, because they don't seem to know what that means. That is different from not allowing commercial aircraft over.
I mean, you don't need the if clause, right? I mean, there's American liberals believed after Obama was in charge that the end of history was back, and they've been deranged ever since. But
yeah,
maybe Macron.
Maybe Macron. Hopefully there's some back pictures somewhere in some of these political movements that have some sense. But if also the marginal American political lines are any indication, there is not a whole lot of hope in the immediate future. And with that said, I have to go do another podcast over on your other channel, so we have to end this now. Dr. Kuba, thank you for coming on. I will sadly, I will probably need you again, unfortunately, fairly soon. But I will also be trying to get some other people on. I'm trying to figure out, I do have some Russian friends who have dissonant views, but are not pro-Western.
Yeah, don't get
I'm trying to get
killed.
on, but I am worried about their safety. So, we'll see if that happens. Thank you, and have a good day, and everybody have a good night. Learn stuff, because it's much better to learn stuff than to spot a bunch of bullshit on the internet.
Maybe you could be our next Macron alternative.
Yeah, hopefully. Or, if you go to an Ivy League school and play the stupid system,
do all the stuff, right?
Yeah.
But
all right. And with that, good night.